So this portfolio is about looking at aerodynamic interactions of a variety of different flows, whether they be laminar, transitional, or turbulent, with flow structures. These structures could be rigid or flexible. They could be stationary, or they could be moving under some kinematically prescribed motion. And we're trying to understand the flow physics of these interactions so that we might ultimately be able to intelligently modify the interaction to some advantage. You see the sub-areas listed here. There are 4 of them. They really break out in the first 2, which is really about flow physics for control. And then the second part of the portfolio is about low Reynolds number unsteady aerodynamics, including aeromechanics for MAVs. So those are just kind of the sub-areas, but the way I want to start the talk today is about how we look for inspiration in the portfolio. And one of the ways we can look for inspiration is to look at boundaries in particular problems. And so I'm going to present 2 types of boundaries that we can look at. The first is the parameter boundaries. Okay, so that is we have a particular flow field. It's described by a certain set of parameters, and we can look at where the boundaries exist for those parameters. And so for fluid dynamicists, or at least for the aerodynamic flows that I'm interested in, the Reynolds number is the most important parameter. And so the Reynolds number just gives us a sense for how important momentum is of the flow, so the velocity of the flow field, to the viscosity in the flow. Okay, and so we've got our Reynolds number here, and of course we have a range of the Reynolds number, all the way from very low Reynolds numbers where we typically get laminar flow, it's smooth and orderly. Sometimes it's not very interesting, but sometimes it can be. And then at the other end, we have high Reynolds numbers where we have turbulent flow, it's disorderly with some asymptotic behavior, and there are lots of very interesting problems up here. Now, so we typically we might think to look at extremes of parameter boundaries, but sometimes there are boundaries that exist between those extremes. With the Reynolds number, there are cases where we have transitional flows. And these can present some very interesting and significant fluid dynamic challenges and flow physics challenges for us, in that sometimes they're not very well behaved, they're not very well defined, and they can be strongly influenced by external factors, like if we have roughness on the surface, or if we have something like free stream turbulence. So some of the inspiration that we get is from looking at parameter boundaries in a flow field. Another place we can look for inspiration is looking at interdisciplinary boundaries. Okay? And so since I'm a fluid dynamicist, it all starts with flow physics, and everything else kind of impinges on that. So one of the places we can look for interesting inspiration is just to say, well, maybe there's some novel materials that are going to allow us to explore fluid dynamic problems in a way that we haven't done before. And so we've got a little bit of sort of speculative work that's going on in the program related to this. I won't actually talk about this right now because it is a little bit out there, and the results are not as quick coming in as we might have expected. But in any event, it's interesting nonetheless. You're going to see a lot of biological inspiration in the second part of the talk. And so here we see a bat in flight, and then the wing of a bat. You've already seen this picture already once this week in Willard Larkin's talk. So we can draw a lot of inspiration from looking at flying mammals or animals. We can draw inspiration from looking at how we can do a better job of energy extraction, perhaps. And this is going to speak to some of the low Reynolds number unsteady aerodynamic problems, as well as potentially the flow control applications. And then something that's a little bit different, which is we can sometimes draw inspiration from interesting chemical interactions that occur in a flow field, and they sort of give us an inkling of an idea of where to look for perhaps some new flow physics or new ways that we might try to control a particular flow field. Okay, so those are some of those are 2 areas where we're going to sort of look for inspiration, and they're going to be sort of bounding the discussion that we have. Okay, so from those inspiration, we can draw out scientific challenges. And I'll warn you up front, this map is going to look a little bit funny, but trust me, it'll come clearer in view in a couple of charts. So the first thing we have is, so in our sort of parameter boundaries, we have some very interesting flow physics that we're exploring. And this is really related to how we do control. There's supposed to be a movie here, but it didn't work, and that's okay. And so here we're looking, it's just we'll talk more about this particular shot, but this is just a transitional flow. It's separating, transitioning, and reattaching. And there's some very interesting and complex flow physics that's happening there. And again, it's happening not at the extremes of a boundary, but rather somewhere in the middle of the parameter space. And then we have sort of an application. Once we understand a little bit more about the flow physics, we have an application where we can actually do flow control. And this is the brownout problem for which we have a Muri in the program. So that kind of takes the flow physics and control side of the program. We also do quite a bit with low Reynolds number unsteady aerodynamics. And this really does draw its inspiration from the flapping wing flight that we observe in animals. And we're looking at this across a wide spectrum. So there's very interesting physics that's going on there. And then we also do quite a bit of fluid structure interaction. Particularly recently, we've been looking at the interactions of membranes. And so those are some of the scientific challenges that we're addressing in the portfolio. And of course, these scientific challenges present us with opportunities for realizing some things that we haven't been able to do in sort of the first 100 or plus years of aerodynamics. And so this is a bit of a recycle from previous years. But anyway, if we can address some of these scientific challenges, we really do gain opportunities maybe for doing gust tolerance and mitigation. We can improve agility. We have very good agility in our airplanes now, but if you compare them to the agility of birds, you might actually say that we don't have quite such a great capability there. We might actually be able to do hovering in maybe a more elegant way, or maybe in a more biomimetic way. We could perhaps reintegrate lift and thrust. So, 100 years ago, we had to separate the two out because we really didn't have a way of understanding it well. Maybe we want to do that, maybe we don't. We'll see. We could conceive of doing reconfigurable aircraft so we can optimize for different parts of the flight regime. We could do coordinated flight or swarming of different creatures. And maybe we can come up with ways to do better drag reduction and enhanced efficiency. Okay, so those are the opportunities that we create from our scientific challenges, and these are all going to require some understanding, or a very good understanding, to be honest, of the aerodynamic structure of interactions and how we can go about controlling those interactions. Okay, so we come back to the scientific challenges because I want to get into some of the highlights for the program. And as I do that, and we look across the sort of the entire portfolio, it would probably be a good idea to have a bit of a map of the portfolio, and that's why I kind of have this sort of strange organization here. So we're going to fade those things out, and we're going to take some inspiration from Harry Beck's 1930s map of the London Underground and create a portfolio map. Okay, and so here we have our areas: flow physics for control, unsteady low Reynolds number aerodynamics, and that bioinspiration, fluid structure interactions, and as well as some flow control here. And we're going to start looking at the portfolio. So here are the PIs in certain parts of the program. And this is the flow physics and control line, which is otherwise, takes its inspiration from the district line. And we're going to talk about a couple of the projects here. Some of these things are more flow physics, basic flow physics oriented, and some of them get to be a little bit more flow control oriented. We also have some very good flow control work that's going on both in the lab as well as in some Muri efforts. I have what I call a flow control collaboration. So I have a number of PIs, and I seem to have lost one of the names. He'll probably show up later, but a number of PIs who have, by virtue of overlap in their problems, really formed what I consider to be a very nice collaboration. They're not all necessarily collaborating with each other, but they're all linked together in some meaningful way, and you'll see hopefully a few of the highlights from those. Okay, so that's kind of flow physics control. We also have the metropolitan line, which is running through this low Reynolds number unsteady aerodynamics and fluid structure interactions, as well as what I call the central line here. So this has a little bit more of a flow physics for MAVs, as well as tapping into some future work that's going to be funded this year. So there we have the portfolio map. We've got some keys to the lines down here. You'll see that there's a lot of other information on here. We see Muri efforts, lab tasks, yips, and so the dotted line means that's a new start. So here's a new yip, and we got another new yip out here with Anya Jones, as well as some fairly established previous year yips going on. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to start, and we're going to move around this map here. I had originally tried to hot link it all, but I realized that wasn't going to be working with the particular presentation style. So we're going to start up here with Mike Graham and take a look at some of the work that he's doing. So this talks a little bit to that chemical interactions motivation. So Mike's a chemical engineer at the University of Wisconsin, and he's done a lot of work with polymer drag reduction. And in doing this work with polymer drag reduction, he observed something about the fundamental behavior of turbulence and its drag, how it creates drag. He noticed that turbulence tends to have regions of when it's very active and when it tends to be more hibernating. So here we have red is vorticity, so this is sort of structure in the turbulent flow, and the green is velocity surfaces. And he says when turbulence is active, it kind of looks like this, and when it's active, it produces a lot of drag, and then it finds these hibernating states where it's sort of relatively calm. Well, it turns out it's not just when you have long-chain polymers in the flow field that it does this, but it actually does, turbulence does this even in just normal flows when you don't have this. But what he thought was, well, okay, this is revealing something about the fundamental behavior of turbulence and how it's creating drag. And so he's asked, well, can we figure out ways where we can sort of have the, can we create a longer winter in turbulence where the active behavior is sort of hibernating? And so notionally, he's got this sort of schematic. It's a little bit crazy, but if you look at it enough, you realize, so imagine we have a flow, it starts here, and it has a choice. It can either go to laminar flow, or it can go up here to this sort of turbulence side, and this blue is supposed to be the surface and state space between these two things. And it spends a lot of time when it's turbulent up over here, which is on a high drag state. But sometimes it sort of goes down and visits closer to that interface and has a lower drag. And the idea behind the work that he's doing is just trying to figure out, are there ways where we can get the flow to spend more time near these low drag excursions? But we're not going to do it with polymer additives because those don't work in air. Okay? So that's a sort of disciplinary, what I've sort of categorized as a disciplinary boundary. We can go back and look at the parameter boundary. So this is some work that's led by Herman Fosl at University of Arizona, looking at boundary layer separation for lifting surfaces. So this is some work that's happening in that Reynolds number regime, right? It's in the middle there. It's not at the extremes. It's at that sort of boundary that exists in the transitional part of the flow field. And so what we see over here on the upper left-hand corner, he's looking at this phenomenon across many decades of Reynolds numbers. So it's not just, oh, we're going to find about it in a particular Reynolds number, but we're going to understand how transition occurs across all sorts of different scales of flow fields. So we see the formation of these separation bubbles. You can kind of see that in the flow vis a little bit if it was a bit darker, but basically the flow separates. It has an instability in it, it transitions, and then it reattaches. He's gone from this flow vis to experimental measurements, and now we're actually seeing in detail what is happening to the structures that form in that separating shear layer. So he's able to trace them along here, and you can see they separate, they form. Here's one that's separated earlier. It's coming down. If we follow it, we notice that it sort of loses its coherence as we get down to here, so these things are breaking up. And he's beginning to understand how this flow field behaves, and not just in a sort of very clean, quiet environment that you get in the laboratory, but also introducing real effects that you might find out in the atmosphere so that what we're learning is going to be applicable outside the laboratory. So in this case, he's looking at the effect of free stream turbulence. He's got experimental results. He also does very good computations. So here we see a sort of a slice through his computational flow field. And I took one of these images and I said, boy, that looks a lot like this computation thing here. So I kind of tried to rotate it and line them up. They're not the same, but they do look very similar. And you can see the structures that occur in the flow field. One of the important implications for this work is the recognition that if you cannot get the correct computational experimental agreement if you do not include this free stream turbulence. They tried this with just a clean code, and what they found is they weren't getting very good agreement, so they weren't learning in the simulations. They weren't reproducing the correct flow physics, and so he had to include that, and when they do that, we get at least, if you're looking at, these are velocity profiles, so distance from the wall, velocity, there's no scale here, but basically you see excellent agreement between the simulations and the experiments. Okay, so the next piece here looks at that sort of some members of that flow control collaboration, and this is work that's done by Lou Catafesta at Florida State, or now at Florida State. He was at University of Florida. Rajat Mittal at Johns Hopkins and Clancy Rowley at Princeton. And so in a number of flows, we have a fairly good idea of some of the physical phenomena that are going on there, but when you have more than one occurring at a particular time, it becomes difficult to understand how to go about controlling that flow field because you're getting nonlinear interactions between these different phenomena. So here's your standard sort of airfoil / wing at high angle of attack, and you've got separation, and you have a number of different phenomena. You have a separating shear layer, which has its own sort of stability behavior. If it reattaches, then you have a separation bubble that's giving you some behavior. And then if you get high enough in angle of attack, you have this wake. And so all of these things are interacting, and the question is, well, how do I go about controlling that flow field? I need to know what it is I have to be sort of addressing. And so that's what they're doing here, is they're really looking at that nonlinear coupling. by doing experiments. That's what Lou's group is doing. The simulations by Rajat Mittal at Hopkins, and Clancy Rowley is a very good sort of dynamical systems kind of controls person who has a good understanding of fluid dynamics and is helping us with the modeling. And so they are finding that there are these nonlinear couplings between the shear layer instability and this wake instability that are driving some of the dynamics. Clancy's been great in that he's sort of really helping move the field forward in understanding how to do good dynamical systems modeling of these flow fields. We used to just do proper orthogonal decomposition and then just say, all right, well, we'll do a projection and hope it all works. And what you were finding is that you really had to be savvy about which modes you took out of your decomposition. And that savvy usually meant putting a grad student in the lab and saying, all right, figure out which ones give us the correct dynamical systems behavior. And that's very time consuming and not very intuitive. And so they're looking at different ways of modeling. He uses something called Koopman modes, is what they've kind of settled on. So here they have the separation bubble behavior as well as the shear layer behavior. And they're doing both simulations and experiments. And they're able to use these dynamical systems techniques both on the experiments and on the simulations. And we can see very good representation of what's going on. So these are the modes that we're getting from the experimental data as well as what we would get if we did the same analysis on the simulation. So we at least think that we're getting a pretty good representation for what's going on. Okay, so all right, Art, the best way to introduce this next topic is just to kind of show you a movie of what happens. Okay, so there is a helicopter in there somewhere. So this next topic is the rotorcraft brownout Muri topic, which is led by Gordon Leishman at the University of Maryland. I really liked that movie. I was grateful when I first saw it because I thought this is perfect. It really illustrates what's going on. It's clearly relevant to, the problems that we face with rotorcraft today. And the other great thing about it is that if you're a fluid dynamicist and you spend any time looking at turbulent flows, you see structure in that flow. And that means, ooh, hey, I can learn something about what's going on fundamentally in there. And I know it's hard to believe, but I can look at that flow and see structure. But I can look at clouds and see structure. So maybe that's not really helpful. So what about this problem? Well, this is a rotor wake. Really, the driver here is a rotor wake in ground effect problem. This is really at the root of what's going on here. It's an unsteady two-phase, three-dimensional fluid dynamics problem. So unless you have combustion going on, this is about as hard as it gets. And I don't know why you would introduce combustion to a problem like this because it's tough enough as it is. But some people forge ahead in any event. So you have a wake impinging on the ground, and it creates these sort of transient excursions in flow velocities, which have unsteady shear stresses and pressures associated with them. You get secondary vortical flows, local regions of flow separation, and then kind of just to make it worse, you've just got turbulence there mixing everything up. The nice thing about what Gordon's group has been doing is when I first saw this, I really thought, wow, that's a cool problem, but that is a huge problem to address. Can we really learn something fundamental about it? And the answer is yes, you can. And that's what Gordon's group has been doing a great job of. And looking at really the different mechanisms that give rise to this brownout cloud formation. And so we've got sort of particle creep going on here. We have saltation processes, so a particle gets lifted up and it comes back and impinges on the ground, and this ejects additional particles. You have vortices that arise from the tip of the rotor, and they're coming down creating low pressures, which is drawing particles up, and you have unsteady shearing. And these are all lifting particles up, and then turbulence comes along and mixes it even further. And if you're in the right conditions, or if you're in the wrong conditions, that cloud gets lifted up, and then it gets entrained into the rotor weight, or into the downflow, and it's just now you have really high velocity particles impacting the ground. So they're doing a great job both experimentally. So Gordon's got experiments going on. He also has students doing simulations. And because they're tracking not just the fluid dynamics of the problem, so the three-dimensional fluid dynamics that's unsteady, but they're also looking at keeping track of the two phases. They've been using some sort of reduced order methods for simulating the flow field, as well as trying to do some Lagrangian sort of particle tracking, sediment particle tracking methods to reproduce both the flow field for what's going on, and that's what you kind of see here. There was a movie, but I couldn't get it to play really well, and so I figured I'll just punt on that. But you can see how this cloud forms. Both with the particle motions, and this is just at the beginning where you see you can see the cross here that indicates the rotor and how the flow field's forming, and then how the particles go. Okay, so I had really hoped to have a little something to demo for you. So this next topic is is kind of an interesting one. So it's not important just to do the fluid dynamics, but it's also important to be able to recognize people in your program who have the opportunity to really help others in the program, and that's what Brian Thoreau really represents. He is a great fluid dynamics diagnostician. Now, what he's been working on recently, so if anybody's been following this small company called Litro, and they're introducing and actually shipping recently what's called a light field camera. And the great thing about this light field camera is you're supposed to be able to do sort of refocusing in a single image. And so Kira Piet, who was one of our social media people, had ordered one of these cameras, and I just went to see her this morning. I said, have you received it? Have you received it? I really want the demo to hold it up. But alas, she's in the second wave of shipping. So conventional imaging, so to get into it here, in conventional imaging systems, what you tend to lose information. You lose angular information about what's happening in the flow field. So here you see your lens, and if you're at the focal point, you get a nice dot. But if you move away from the focal point, you get sort of a blurred image. And it's ambiguous. You can't tell whether the dot is in front of or behind the focal point. So what Brian's been working on is something called a planoptic camera idea. And so what you're doing is you're introducing an array of lenslets, all right, between the main lens and the imaging CCD. And what you do then is as that object moves away from the focal point is you're getting unambiguous representation on the array. And so what this is allowing him to do is recover both position and angle of the light arrays as they come in. And so what he's doing, okay, so here's just a picture of a camera. It's just a normal CCD camera, and what they do is they put this lenslet array in between there. And so here we have a set of 3 images that were created from a single realization. Right? So it's a single image, but it's just processed differently. All right? And so depending on how you process it, you can either get near field focal point, you can get midfield focal, and so here's the AFOSR logo in that, or you can focus it farther out. So with a single picture, right, we can focus it over a fairly wide sort of depth of field range. And then you can also focus it so that process it so that everything is in focus. And so what they're doing, oops, wrong button, is they've just sort of tested the algorithms for how to do this. So what you're seeing here is it's a spherical vortex. Maybe it's a little bit difficult to see, but they've created this sort of spherical vortex flow field, and they're using the same algorithm. They're testing out their algorithms to figure out, to calculate what amounts to being velocity vectors, also all those little red arrows there, as well as vorticity, which they're calculating in a particular plane. And the great thing about this is going to allow us to do 3-dimensional diagnostics. So this is going to allow us to get 3 components of velocity in 3 spatial dimensions. So we have a lot of data right now. If you're an experimentalist, even if you're a computational person, you can get a lot of data. This is going to give us even more data, which is a good thing, but can also be a bad thing if we don't know how to use it sort of properly. But that's another challenge that we're going to have to address. In any event, Brian is doing a great job of interacting and working with other people in the program. In fact, you'll see him right here. He is part of this group, and he's working with Farouk Alvi, who's at FSU, and Lou Catafesta, who's at FSU, and they're really creating a nice partnership, as well as Brian has been reaching out to other people like James Buchholz, who's a young investigator. And so I'm really optimistic about the way he sort of integrates parts of the portfolio. So what we've done so far now, looking back at our map, is we've kind of spent some time over here in flow physics and control and flow control. And now what we're going to do is we're going to come over and look a little bit more at the bioinspiration and the problems that arise from that. All right, so no presentation for me would be complete if I didn't have some pictures of some flying bats from my the Mary team up at Brown University, made up of Kenny Breuer, Sharon Swartz, and a number of other people at different locations, Jaime Perari, Cindy Moss at University of Maryland. And so what I really like about these movies is that if you look at this bat, he's just flying in she, I don't know, just in cruising flight in a wind tunnel. You get a lot of interesting sort of, you can see the rich dynamics and kinematics that exists here with the flapping flight. You can also see vibrations in the membrane here. You heard earlier from Willard Larkin about the intrinsic muscles that exist in these bats' wings and what's the role that they play. They're also capable of amazing sort of sort of agile flight. What they're doing here is they're actually tricking a bat. There used to be a net up here, and it would come up and grab a hold, and they took the net away, and it comes up, and it kind of does like this skateboard technique where it touches the ceiling and comes back down. But what this does is it really gives us sort of some inspiration to look at sort of animal flight and mammal flight. Of course, you know, really challenging and interesting problems like that have a lot of sort of very hard questions and challenges that are associated with them. So we have unsteady, if it's flapping flight, they're reasonably periodic, but you know, to what extent do quasi-steady tools work to understand those flow fields? They're three-dimensional, but you know, if we look at along the span of a wing, is there some two-dimensional aspects there? Can we treat this as sort of quasi 2D, 3D type of flow, or do we really need to do a full three-dimensional? Because they tend to be small flying creatures at low velocities, they tend to have lower Reynolds numbers, so that's down at the other end, the low Reynolds number end of the spectrum. A lot of the techniques that we have for unsteady aerodynamics were developed for inviscid approximations. How good are those now at capturing aspects of the physics? Because they're low Reynolds number, they tend to be in sort of the laminar transitional regime, and this has important implications if we're trying to simulate the flow field, because we have to be able to resolve, or the question is, how well do we have to be able to resolve those flows? You're going to see that there tends to be separation in what are called leading edge vortices. These are very important actually to the generation of lift, particularly for insects. So what is the role of those, and is there some sort of universal behavior? And then you know, wing kinematics, how important is the kinematics? Can we extract some information by using simpler kinematics? And then finally, wing flexibility. What is the role of that in driving the aerodynamic behavior? So I think we have a really good sort of spectrum of activities in the portfolio in the bio-inspired aerodynamics section, everything from what looked like relatively low complexity sort of experimental setups to very high complexity ones. I'm not meaning to imply that these are easy problems down here, but rather that they look at things like, well, we have a clear plexiglass plate that's just sort of waving through a particular motion, but we get some very interesting fluid dynamics that arises from that, these leading edge vortex formation. In order to capture these flow fields, we have to do high fidelity simulations because of the sort of laminar transitional turbulent kind of flow field. And so we have good interactions between Miguel Visbal at the Air Force Research Lab and Don Rockwell at Lehigh looking at these three-dimensional flow fields. As we kind of go up in complexity, we realize, you know, that with whether it's an animal, a mammal like a bat, or whether it's a bird or an insect, that these are very lightweight creatures, and because they're lightweight, there tends to be very important contributions from flexibility. So how does the wing structure affect that? And we've got some work looking at flexibility. And then finally, we get into sort of the flagship part of the program, this MIRI from 07 that's wrapping up in the next 6 months or so. So I want to start this sort of differently. I want to look a little bit at evolutionary biology. So we're just going to see how some of the aerodynamics is impacting this. Okay, so 50 million years ago, bats evolved from gliding to powered flight. But the question is what were the evolutionary pressures that sort of drove to do that? And what we saw here earlier, now it's moving, but you saw what appeared to be nothing happening, and that's because the velocity of a particular flow field. So here we have just an approximation to a flexible wing. It's two rigid pieces connected by a flexible joint. We'll see if it's going to play again. Yeah, it's playing it. Nothing's happening. There is flow moving past here, but it's below the critical velocity. And so when it's below the critical velocity, you're not getting anything happening. But when it gets above that, you get this oscillating motion. And it turns out those self-excited oscillations give us an increase in lift. Okay, so that's interesting. So here, fluid dynamics is able to tell us maybe a little bit about how evolution, how evolutionary pressures and processes took place to go from sort of gliding flight to this powered flight in mammals. And this is some work. Sorry, this is work that was done at Brown University under the 07 MIRI. So here we have kind of a neat movie. You saw a still from this picture. There's not really much to say about this other than, gee, that's a complicated flow field. Really the punchline is here's, okay, so that's the previous slide showed two rigid plates with some flexibility. Now we're actually talking about a fully flexible membrane. You can't see the membrane moving here, but we can see the consequence of having a flexible membrane here. So here we have a rigid flat wing. Here's what the flow field looks like. We're looking at surface pressure as well as some surface streamlines. If we have a rigid cambered wing, that just means it's sort of curved from front to back. And then if we have a fully flexible wing and we're getting changes in the surface pressure as well as the flow field, the punchline here is what's happening to the important things like lift and drag and aerodynamic efficiency and pitching moment. Well, we get an increase in the lift if we have a flexible. So if we're looking at going down, on the lift side here, so from 0.96 to 1.02, so we got a little bit of a boost there. There's a penalty in the drag, so that's unfortunate, and we see that in L/D, which is kind of a measure of aerodynamic efficiency. But we do gain some things over here in what's called CMY. This is a pitching moment. So you hear a lot in aerodynamics about lift and drag. But what's equally important in aerodynamics is the pitching moment. That's why you have that big tail out in the back of your airplane, because you've got to deal with the negative, the nose down moment that's arising from that wing. So perhaps there's something in that. Perhaps it wasn't just lift and drag, perhaps it was more of a stabilization effect that arises from flexibility. Okay, so if we're moving along this from rigid, that are joined at a single joint, to now fully flexible membranes, now let's imagine that creatures are evolving, they're beginning to think, okay, well what about actually having, now we're going to actually have some prescribed motions. And because we're timid and we don't want to go too big, we'll just have small amplitude oscillations. And that's what McGursel's doing at the University of Bath. He's got a number of different planform shapes here, so rectangular, elliptical. These are all just wings. The flow is coming in from sort of the upper left-hand corner in here like this, and he's just oscillating that wing a little bit up and down and trying to understand what effect that has on the flow field and whether or not you can actually do that whether that you could prescribe that motion and do some sort of flow control. So you could envision that you might design a structure that would do this naturally under certain conditions, and maybe this might help energy efficiency. Just kind of throwing that out there as an idea. In any event, looking at the effect of small amplitude plunging. Now, one of the things you're going to see that you see in all these pictures are these sort of tubular structures. So this is along the span from the root here out to the tip. So from here out to the tip, because it's kind of just going up and down like that. And these are vortices. So this is a vortex that's formed at the leading edge of the wing. You see tip vortices. These are the things that spiral off. You see the crop duster pictures, right? And then this is a trailing edge vortex that's formed. And we're seeing different phases during the up and down cycle. And it turns out that these vortices are very important in driving the dynamics of what's happening in these particular flow fields. And so here's some work that Matt Ringet, who's a YIP from 2010, has been doing. And he's looking at, so here's his wing. Here's kind of the experimental setup with a top-down view. But all he has is just a rectangular plate, and it's just being rotated through a certain number of degrees. It's got a certain span to it, which we define as aspect ratio, and a certain angle of attack. And what he's doing is he's saying, well, let's look closely at these vortices. The vortices that form at the leading edge, the one that's at the tip, and the thing that's coming off the bottom here. And he's looking at, depending upon how big this plate is, so aspect ratio 2, aspect ratio 4, so twice as long in the span-wise direction. He's looking at what's happening. How do those vortices interact in that particular flow field? And the intent is that here he's got, these are very recent results. He has these experimental measurements, but what he wants to do is understand not just what they look like, those are pretty pictures, experimentally obtained images of the flow field, but what is the vorticity and circulation associated with those vortices, and then can we come up with some sort of understanding of the scaling of these particular flow fields? Because there's some evidence that vortices under certain conditions behave in a sort of universally scaled kind of way. All right, so we can gain inspiration not just from the flapping behavior, but also from the maneuvers that flying creatures undertake. And so if we take, this is just a wing, we have some simulations. This is the work from Don Rockwell and Miguel Visbal. So the simulations are by Miguel using his three-dimensional implicit code at the Air Vehicles Director, and then Don Rockwell at Lehigh does some fabulous experimental measurements. So what we're seeing here is basically the yellow surface here. The flow is coming from the upper left-hand corner. That's kind of what we're trying to orient you here. But this is basically the surface of a structure that you would see on the flow field. So this is, you could think of this as almost like dye. And then he's cut through it, and looking at it, you get this sort of almost owl face type picture. But what this is showing us is what is the structure of the separation of this flow field look like when you're getting this sort of rapid pitch up. So this would be a motion that would be, say, representative of a bird coming in and trying to perch. It's coming in, flying, flows nice and attached, and then it rapidly pitches up and creates a lot of drag, and it slows down and sort of drops down in. So Don's got the experiments, and they have really good comparison with the simulations that Miguel's got. So that's exciting. So this gets a little bit more into micro-air vehicles, and so the future of this work, it's not that I don't think Jeff Eldridge does good work, but if in fact the rumors are true, we might have to think about how we can sort of, how this work fits differently in the program. But these are very complex flow fields, and if we want to do design, say, of an Agile micro-air vehicle, we need to understand how to sort of do a simpler representation of this so we can do things like design optimization for doing a better job of figuring out what's happening in the flow. You can't be doing the kind of simulations that Miguel's doing because, frankly, you just don't have the time to do that because they take so long. So what Jeff's been working on is a variety of techniques for developing sort of getting better simulation techniques but using a lot fewer sort of degrees of freedom. So he's coming up with ways to say, okay, here's a high fidelity simulation, has 1,000,000 degrees of freedom. Can I get a pretty good representation with 6? Okay, so that's quite a simplification of the problem. Here you see some high fidelity results. He can do both things, both high fidelity and lower order. But can we get a good representation by doing sort of simpler representations like you see here that don't capture all the details, but how important is that? And it turns out that, well, we can do okay on some things. You know, the lift isn't too bad here, so the green line is the low order model. It overestimates the high fidelity simulation. This is early work, so this has just started in the last year. We're probably not so good on the drag. We might want to do a better job with that. But it's, you know, we're beginning to understand how to model these particular flow fields. Okay, and so sort of the final piece here is some work from Dave Williams and Tim Colonius. And this is kind of bridging the two parts of the portfolio. It's taking low Reynolds runs to the aerodynamics and the flow control and saying, how can we sort of bring those things together? So when we look at what an albatross can do, is it really can remain aloft indefinitely. And how does it do that? Well, it turns out we can get model gliders that can also fly at 400 miles an hour. How does that happen? It doesn't have an engine on it. Well, how does it do it? Well, it does it by something called dynamic soaring. So in dynamic soaring, what you're doing is extracting energy from spatial velocity gradients in the wind. So an albatross will do this in the lee of an ocean swell. A model glider will do it in the lee of a hill under high wind conditions. Turns out if you have an unsteady flow coming in, you can do a similar type behavior if you just know how to time things relatively. Oops, sorry. And so what happens is you fly in across this spatial gradient of velocity, you get this lift and drag vector. It tends to be tilted forward on your object, which gives you an apparent thrust. So you're picking out a component of the lift, pushing forward against the drag, and if you do this repeatedly, which is what an albatross will do in the lee of an ocean swell, or these model gliders will fly these circles, you can look for videos on YouTube, but you can't really see anything because at 400 miles an hour, when you got something this big, it's kind of hard to keep track of it. In any event, if you look at the punch line down here, so ignore all the other stuff down here, here's the yellow line, which is at 0, and you can see data points above it. So that means if I just know how to time things relative to that incoming gust, I can do energy extraction. Well, what Dave and Tim want to do is not just do the timing right, but also do flow control to sort of help that energy extraction. And so the final chart that I'll just throw up there is this is a new initiative that started this past year with David Stargel and myself in RSA, as well as colleagues Tatiana Kirchik, Fariba Faru, and John Lugensland and other parts of the organization. And it's really looking at ways where we can have, we're looking at transformational approaches in computing, and we've chosen to explore how can quantum computing architectures specifically advance aerospace computing. It's an out there topic, but I think the idea is to get people from aerospace and quantum computing talking earlier in the sort of development life cycle of quantum computing so that the aerospace people, I think, and primarily aren't sort of caught unaware. And so we funded two projects just recently. David Meyer at UCSD, he's the lead of the team, and Payman Givey at Pitt, and you can see some information about them. Thank you. Only a minute and a half, sorry.
So we have a few minutes for questions, if there's a question or a comment.
So they've been modeling flat plates for a long time. And so, you know, in those modelings that you showed, they're showing pitching of the plates. But that's not really, you know, what's happening in the wing. And so the wing will pitch up, but the wing's also flexing. There's a lot of things happening. And so I guess my question is, since the models have been around for a while, why can't they put that other stuff in?
Well, we are. I mean, I tried to show that a little bit in that sort of spectrum of activities thing, and then I just highlighted a few of the pieces of work that are going on. But so the rigid plate type things is it's the somewhat simplistic, but there's a very rich amount of aerodynamics that's going on there. But there are other parts of the portfolio, as you kind of get up mid-level in that complexity range. We're introducing flexibility, so membrane flexibility. We're looking at the structure of the wing and how that introduces flexibility. It's tough. If you go out and look at nature, there's a myriad of different ways that you can sort of structure the wing, and each one's going to have its own unique flexibility characteristics. So how do you extract a canonical problem out of that and say, oh, I'm going to study this because it captures what I need? But the program does have that. I just happen to choose because it kind of worked in a particular flow that I thought might be appealing. But yes, we're doing that. It's not easy, though.
What sort of coordination in terms of turbulence studies do you have with ONR? I mean, they have ships, they have propellers that are generating turbulence.
Right.
I realize one's a liquid, the other but do you have, if you drew one of your subway maps, is there a long link to related activities?
So the turbulence work that's going on at ONR, primarily in Ron Joslin's group there, is much more sort of fundamental turbulence surface kind of, it's turbulence on a flat plate kind of thing, which I think overlaps a little bit more with John Schmisser's program than with mine as such. Although they have some interest in flow control related concepts, so circulation control, acoustic signatures, some circulation control. There's not a huge sort of connection there, but we're the turbulence part that you asked about, I try not to sort of step on the pure turbulence research because I feel that's sort of lies within John Schmisser's portfolio, and I sort of keep it focused on things that have some sort of unique structural aspect to the problem. So that might be, it's not that I'm interested in turbulent shear layers, but they kind of have to be, say, in a cavity, or they have to be separating and reattaching from a structure of some sort. So maybe that, I'm kind of passing the buck here to John, but we coordinate. I mean, I coordinate with Ron to the extent that it's possible, I guess.
Your work on energy extraction from unsteady winds. We've been working with AFRL for my command for some time on formation flying for fuel efficiency, which is a form of energy extraction too. Right. There we have a very predictable energy flow pattern that you can extract energy from. Is there any potential here for synergy between what you're doing and what they're doing?
You mean for formation flight? Or?
I'm talking about the energy extraction for...
I guess...
maybe we can talk about it offline.
I understand the efficiency gained by flying in formation.
It's a form of energy extraction, though, and that's
okay.
that's where I'm coming from.
I'm not aware of specifically what energy extraction is going on there. I mean, so yeah,
okay.
We need to talk about that.
We'll talk about it offline.
Yeah.